My name is Evelyn Croft. I am 72 years old, and my hands, though now spotted with age, still know the delicate art of handling history. For 40 years, I was a historian and senior archivist at a university library, a custodian of fragile truths. My world was one of quiet reverence, of the faint, dry, vanilla-like scent of decaying paper, the soft rustle of manuscript pages turning, the satisfying heft of a bound volume of letters. I spoke the language of provenance, of primary sources, of footnotes that told stories more fascinating than the main text. My life's work was to ensure that history, the real, unvarnished, often inconvenient truth of it, was preserved, honored, and understood. A historian, I used to tell my students, is a detective whose crime is forgetting and whose victim is the truth. My own history, however, has been a masterclass in the deliberate erasure of my own narrative. For the past 30 years, I have been the silent, uncredited, and utterly essential primary source for the life of my only son, Thomas. My own ambitions, my own career, my own story, they were all carefully boxed up, labeled miscellaneous, and relegated to the dusty attic of my life to make room for his. The intellectual rigor I once applied to authenticating a 19th century manuscript, I instead applied to managing his finances. The passion I once had for uncovering forgotten stories, I channeled into fabricating a narrative of his success. I did this with the fierce, blind, all-consuming love of a mother. I called it giving him a better life. Now, in the stark, unforgiving light of hindsight, I see I was merely the ghostwriter of a life he falsely claimed as his own. Before Thomas, there was another Evelyn, a younger woman, on the verge of a significant academic breakthrough. My field was the history of early female entrepreneurs, the forgotten women who built small empires in the 19th century, milliners, publishers, hoteliers. I had uncovered a treasure trove of letters and ledgers belonging to a woman named Eliza May Collins, a shipping magnate in New England, who had disguised her identity using her brother's name. It was a story of breathtaking courage, intelligence, and subterfuge. I had been awarded a prestigious fellowship at the Huntington Library in California to write the definitive biography. It was to be my magnum opus, the culmination of a decade of meticulous research. The acceptance letter, printed on heavy cream-colored stock, felt like a medal in my hands. It was the blueprint for a life of intellectual fulfillment, a life where my name, Evelyn Croft, would be printed on the spine of a book, a permanent entry in the great card catalog of history. Then, two life-altering events occurred in rapid succession. My husband, a kind but financially impractical professor of poetry, died suddenly of a heart attack. And just weeks later, my parents were killed in a car crash. I was left a widow at 35, an orphan, and the sole inheritor of a surprisingly substantial legacy, the result of my father's quiet, lifelong, and incredibly shrewd investments. In the span of a month, my world was shattered and then rebuilt on a foundation of grief and unexpected wealth. I was adrift, and the only anchor I had was my 5-year-old son, Thomas. The fellowship to the Huntington Library was deferred, then deferred again, and then quietly declined. How could I move across the country, uproot my grieving son, and immerse myself in the 19th century when the 20th century was demanding so much of me? The biography of Eliza May Collins went unwritten. Her ledgers and letters eventually returned to the archive, her story waiting for another historian, another time. My own story was put on hold. Instead, I took my inheritance, my father's legacy, the money that was supposed to secure my own comfortable old age, and I made a different kind of investment. I invested it all in Thomas. I saw it as my sacred duty, a way to build a fortress around him, to protect him from the harsh winds of fate that had buffeted my own life. I used the money to send him to the best private schools, to buy him the clothes, the computers, the cars that his peers all had. I wanted him to feel secure, to feel a sense of belonging I had just lost. My career, once a source of passion, became merely a source of income. I stayed at the university library, but I turned down promotions that would require more travel or longer hours. I became a fixture, reliable and quiet, managing the archives, my own ambitions slowly turning brittle and yellow like old newsprint. The final and largest withdrawal from my own life's account came when Thomas, fresh out of business school, decided he wanted to start his own company. He had a big idea, a tech startup focused on a new kind of marketing software. He had the charisma, the vision, the confidence. What he didn't have was the capital. He came to me, his eyes shining with the unshakable conviction of a young man who has never been told no. "This is it, Mom," he'd said, spreading a business plan across my dining room table. "This is the one, but the banks won't touch a startup without a track record. I need a seed investor." I looked at his plan. It was ambitious. It was risky. But I also saw the ghost of my own unfulfilled dream. The dream of building something. And I looked at my son, and I wanted more than anything for him to succeed where I had chosen not to. So I did it. I took the vast majority of what remained of my inheritance, the fortress fund that was meant for my own retirement, and I gave it to him. But not as a gift. Even in my love, the historian and archivist in me, the woman who believed in documentation and the hard truth of a paper trail, insisted on doing it properly. We sat with a lawyer. Me lawyer. I had the investment structured as a formal business loan, with the shares of his new company, Innovatech, held as collateral. I became, on paper, the silent majority shareholder and primary creditor of his enterprise. The documents were signed, notarized, and I filed them away in a fireproof box, the same kind I used for priceless historical records. Thomas, in his youthful arrogance, saw the paperwork as a mere formality, a quirk of his fussy academic mother. He saw the money as his due, a gift. He never truly understood, or perhaps never wanted to understand, the legal reality of the transaction. He was the brilliant CEO. I was just the silent, invisible bank. And he was successful. To my astonishment and pride, Innovatech took off. Thomas became the man I had always hoped he would be, a respected, self-made entrepreneur. He bought a beautiful house. He drove an expensive car. He met and fell in love with Isabel, a woman whose family moved in circles of old money and quiet, ruthless power. I should have been overjoyed. But a strange thing happened. The more successful he became, the more my own role in that success was minimized, then ignored, then erased entirely. The narrative he and Isabel crafted for public consumption was one of a brilliant young man who had built an empire from scratch, armed with nothing but his own genius. My contribution, the very foundation of his success, became an inconvenient footnote, and then it was redacted from the official history altogether. I became once again just his sweet mom, the retired librarian, a quaint, slightly embarrassing relic from a past he was eager to transcend. The wedding was to be the crowning achievement of their carefully constructed narrative. It was not merely a wedding, it was a merger. The union of Thomas Croft, the brilliant new money tech prodigy, and Isabel de Winter, the beautiful pedigreed daughter of one of the city's most powerful investment bankers. The event was held at the de Winter family's sprawling country estate, a place of breathtaking, intimidating beauty. The ancient stone house was draped in swags of white roses, the vast lawns were dotted with glowing lanterns, and an army of uniformed staff moved with silent, unnerving efficiency. From the moment I arrived, I felt like a misplaced archival document, a dusty, leather-bound volume in a room of glossy, unread paperbacks. My dress, a simple but elegant silk sheath in a deep burgundy, had cost a small fortune by my standards, but next to the couture gowns of Isabel's mother and her friends, it felt homespun. They were a flock of magnificent, predatory birds, all sharp angles, glittering jewels, and whispered, critical asides. They looked at me with a kind of polite, dismissive curiosity, their eyes flicking over my sensible shoes. I was the quaint, historical artifact that had to be tolerated for the sake of the groom. The humiliation, when it came, was not a public spectacle. It was a private, surgical strike, delivered with a smile, which made it all the more devastating. It happened just before the ceremony was about to begin. I was sitting alone on a small velvet bench in a quiet anteroom, trying to catch my breath, when Thomas and Isabel found me. "There you are, Mom," Thomas said, his voice unnaturally bright. He was handsome in his tuxedo, but he looked pale and strained. He couldn't quite meet my eye. Isabel stood beside him, a vision in white lace, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture that looked less like affection and more like ownership. Her smile was dazzling, but it did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Evelyn," she said, her voice as smooth and cool as the pearls around her neck. "We are so thrilled you're here. It means the world to us." "Of course, darling," I said. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." "Good," she continued, her smile tightening just a fraction. "And we want you to just relax and enjoy the day. Completely. No stress." "Oh, Iris?" Thomas finally looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Mom, we were just talking. You know how the toasts are going to work. We have the best man, the maid of honor, and then Isabel's father is going to say a few words. It's all very structured." I knew what was coming. Cold dread, heavy and familiar, began to pool in the pit of my stomach. "Isabel's family, they're different," he stammered, gesturing vaguely. "They're very formal, private. They're not used to, well, you know." "No, Thomas," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I don't know. Tell me." He flinched at my directness. It was Isabel who stepped in, her voice still syrupy sweet, but with an underlying edge of steel. "What Tom is trying to say, Evelyn, is that we have everything planned, down to the minute. And a spontaneous emotional speech. It could be a little awkward. It could throw off the tone we're trying to create." The euphemisms were suffocating. I felt my patience, already worn thin, begin to fray. "What tone is that, Isabel?" Her smile finally faltered. A flicker of annoyance crossed her perfect face. "The tone of a refined, elegant celebration," she said, as if explaining something to a simple-minded child. "Not a sentimental, small-town wedding." And then came the killing blow, delivered by my own son. He took a deep breath and looked at a point on the wall just over my head. "Mom," he said, his voice low and miserable. "We just want tonight to be perfect, so it would be best for everyone. It would make things easier for Amelia if you just didn't give a speech. Please, don't say anything, just smile and raise your glass when the time comes. Just stay quiet." "Stay quiet." "Well," the words, so casually, so cruelly delivered, were not a request. They were a command. I was being ordered to erase myself. I was being told that my voice, the voice of his mother, the voice of the woman who had funded his entire existence, was an embarrassment. My history, our shared history, was a narrative that was to be suppressed. I was a footnote he was trying to delete. The beautiful, paneled room seemed to tilt. The muffled sound of the string quartet in the distance faded to a dull roar. In my mind, I saw a flash of myself as a young woman, passionately arguing a historical point in a dusty seminar room. I saw myself holding my father's meticulously kept investment ledgers. I saw myself at the lawyer's office, signing the documents that created Innovatech. My entire life had been about finding my voice, about preserving truths, about keeping the record straight. And now, my own son was ordering me into silence, asking me to be complicit in the falsification of my own history. I looked at his face, the face of a weak, frightened man terrified of his new powerful wife. And I looked at her, the smiling, polished predator who saw me as a loose end to be tied up and silenced. In that moment, the loving, accommodating mother who had spent 30 years putting her son first vanished. She did not die with a scream, but with a sudden, deathly, silent cold. In her place stood the historian, the archivist, the custodian of the truth. And she knew, with a clarity that was as sharp and cold as ice, that history was about to be made. The official record of this day was about to have a rather large, and very public addendum. I gave them a small, serene smile. My face felt like a mask, but I was sure it was a convincing one. "Of course, darlings," I said, my voice a perfect imitation of gentle, maternal acquiescence. "I understand completely. I wouldn't dream of making things awkward. I'll be as quiet as a mouse." They left me then, in the quiet anteroom, their faces flooded with a palpable, patronizing relief. They had managed the Evelyn situation. The doddering, sentimental old mother had been successfully neutralized. I heard their footsteps recede down the polished marble hallway, followed by the bright, artificial laughter of Isabel as she greeted a new arrival. I was alone, surrounded by the opulent trappings of a life I had financed, but was not welcome to narrate. I sat on the velvet bench, my hands clasped in my lap, and I did not weep. The historian in me, the archivist, does not deal in tears. She deals in facts, in evidence, in the cold, hard, immutable truth of the written record. The words my son had spoken, "Just stay quiet," were not just a cruel request. They were a historical crime. They were an act of erasure, an attempt to falsify the official record of his own life, of my life. He was attempting to build his future on a fraudulent foundation, and he was asking me, the very architect of that foundation, to be a silent accomplice to the deception. The grief I felt was not for the insult itself, but for the profound, devastating realization of who my son had become. He wasn't just weak, a man easily led by a more powerful personality. He was a willing participant in his own myth-making, a man so desperate to belong to this new, glittering world, that he was willing to deny the very ground upon which he stood. He was ashamed of me, not of anything I had done, but of my very existence, because my simple, unadorned reality was a threat to his carefully curated image of the self-made man. My love for him, which had been a vast, warm, sunlit ocean, began to recede. The tide went out with a terrifying speed, leaving behind a cold, barren, rocky shoreline. The mother in me, the one who would have forgiven him anything, who would have swallowed this hurt as she had swallowed so many others, was gone. She had been assassinated in this quiet, pretty room. In her place stood the historian. And the historian does not forgive the falsification of records. She corrects them. My mind, trained for decades to organize facts, to see patterns, to construct narratives from disparate pieces of evidence, began to work with a chilling, exhilarating clarity. The wedding, this whole magnificent, fraudulent spectacle, was not an ending. It was a forum. It was a symposium. It was a room full of primary and secondary sources, all gathered to witness a historical event. And a historian's duty, when presented with a falsified narrative in a public forum, is to stand up and offer a correction for the record. My speech would not be the sentimental, tearful rambling they feared. Oh no. It would be something far more devastating. It would be a primary source document. It would be an archival finding aid. It would be a perfectly structured, fact-based, and utterly irrefutable presentation of the financial history of Innovatech. It would be delivered with the calm, dispassionate authority of a scholar presenting her research. And it would be a bombshell. I looked around the room, at the silk wallpaper and the antique furniture. This world, this life of theirs, was built on a lie. And a lie, like a poorly constructed building, cannot stand once its foundations are exposed. I had the blueprints to the foundation. I had the receipts. I had the original, notarized, ironclad legal documents. My secret weapon wasn't just the knowledge I held. It was the physical proof. The archivist in me, the woman who believed in the tangible, undeniable power of the written word, had been meticulous. When I had funded Innovatech, it was not with a handshake and a mother's blessing. It was with a series of legally binding documents drawn up by my lawyer, Mr. Davies, the same cautious, thorough lawyer who handled my parents' estate. I remembered the day we signed them. Thomas had been impatient, seeing it all as a fussy, unnecessary delay. "Mom, is all this really necessary?" he had sighed, tapping his pen on the polished table of the lawyer's office. History teaches us that clarity is always necessary, Thomas, I had replied calmly. A clear record prevents future misunderstandings. Those documents, which he had so casually signed and immediately forgotten, were a masterpiece of quiet, legal foresight. The first was a straightforward business loan agreement, detailing the exact principal amount, the sum of my entire inheritance, with a modest but firm interest rate, compounded annually. The second, and more important, was the collateral agreement. To secure the loan, Thomas had signed over a 90% controlling stake in the shares of the new company, Innovatech, to me. He was the CEO, the face of the company. But I was, on paper, the silent majority owner. The third document was the most crucial, a clause Mr. Davies had suggested. It was an acceleration clause, a standard feature in commercial loans, stating that if certain conditions were breached, or if the creditor simply lost confidence in the management, the entire loan, principal plus all accrued interest, would become immediately due and payable. These documents were not in a bank vault. They were where I kept all my most precious records, in a small fireproof archival box in the study of my quiet, unassuming home. My decision was made. It was not a decision born of rage or a desire for petty revenge. It was a decision born of a lifetime of dedication to the truth. It was the cold, clear, and absolute decision of a historian about to set the record straight. I was not going to make a toast. I was going to deliver a keynote address. I stood up from the velvet bench, my movements no longer hesitant, but fluid and purposeful. The ceremony was due to start in 30 minutes. Just enough time. I found a young, bored-looking member of the catering staff standing by a service door. I gave him a warm, slightly dotty old lady smile. "Young man," I said, my voice full of a gentle urgency. "I seem to have forgotten my heart medication. My foolish old head, it's on my kitchen table. Would it be terribly much trouble for you to call me a taxi? I live just 20 minutes away. I can be back long before the bride walks down the aisle." He saw a flustered old woman, not a woman on a mission of historical retribution. He was, of course, happy to help. The taxi ride was a blur of green countryside. I did not look at the scenery. I sat in the back, my handbag on my lap, and I mentally rehearsed. I was not outlining a speech full of emotion. I was outlining a financial report. I structured it in my mind. Introduction, praise and platitudes. Part 1, the founding capital. Part 2, the legal structure of the investment. Part 3, a review of company performance and management. And the conclusion, the calling in of the loan. It was logical. It was irrefutable. It was devastating. At my house, I let myself in and walked directly to my study. My hands were steady as I unlocked the fireproof box. There they were. The original, notarized documents resting in a neat, acid-free folder. I took them out. The paper felt cool and solid, heavy with the weight of truth. I also took the most recent annual report from Innovatech that Thomas had sent me. A glossy, self-congratulatory document he sent as a courtesy, never imagining I read it with a bookkeeper's critical eye. I selected a few key pages, the signed signature page of the loan agreement, the stock allocation schedule, and the acceleration clause. I placed these, along with the glossy annual report, into my formal evening bag. It was a tight fit, but they went in. My handbag no longer contained lipstick and a handkerchief. It contained a corporate death warrant. I was back at the estate with 10 minutes to spare. I slipped back into the anteroom, my heart beating, not with anxiety, but with a cold, thrilling, and powerful sense of purpose. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a guest. I was an archivist about to present her findings. I was a historian about to reclaim a stolen narrative. I smoothed down my dress, took a deep, calming breath, and went to take my seat for the ceremony. I was, after all, the mother of the groom, and I had a speech to prepare. The ceremony itself passed in a beautiful, meaningless haze. I watched my son at the altar, standing beside his radiant, triumphant bride, and I felt a profound, chilling sense of detachment. I was watching two strangers. The vows they exchanged, promising honesty and fidelity, were a mockery, and I was the sole congregant who knew it. When the officiant pronounced them man and wife, and the guests erupted in joyful applause, I simply smiled, a serene, enigmatic expression that I had perfected over the past hour. My mind was elsewhere, fine-tuning the phrasing of my speech, ensuring each word was a perfectly sharpened instrument. The reception was held in a massive, beautifully lit marquee on the lawn. The air was filled with the scent of roses and expensive champagne, the sound of a live jazz band, and the cheerful, meaningless chatter of the wealthy at play. I sat at my assigned table, the one designated for the close family, a cruel irony. I was seated between a great aunt of Isabel's, who was deaf in one ear, and a distant cousin, who was engrossed in his phone. I was, as they had intended, effectively silenced, an island of quiet dignity in a sea of performative joy. I ate little, but I watched everything. I watched Thomas, flushed with champagne and success, accept the backslapping congratulations of Isabel's father and his circle of powerful, predatory men. I watched Isabel, a queen surveying her court, laugh her tinkling, artificial laugh. They were stars of the show, and they were playing their parts to perfection. They moved through the room with the easy, confident grace of people who believe their own publicity. They would occasionally glance over at my table, see me sitting quietly, and exchange a small, satisfied smile. The problem had been contained. The toasts began after the main course. The best man, a boisterous young man from Thomas's college days, gave a rambling, good-natured speech full of embarrassing anecdotes that made Thomas laugh, but Isabel's smile tightened. Then the maid of honor, Isabel's equally polished sister, delivered a speech that was less a toast and more a recitation of Isabel's social and academic resume. It was flawless, elegant, and completely devoid of any genuine emotion. Then, Isabel's father, a formidable man named Arthur de Winter, with a leonine mane of white hair and the cold, dead eyes of a shark, rose to speak. He stood at the microphone, a glass of champagne in his hand, and delivered a speech that was a masterclass in corporate-style power dynamics. He spoke of the merger of their two great families. He praised Thomas, but in a way that subtly positioned him as a promising junior acquisition. He spoke of Thomas's impressive bootstrapped company, Innovatech, and how he looked forward to guiding his future growth. The word bootstrapped echoed in the vast tent, a lie so grand, so audacious, that I almost gasped. He was in real time cementing the false narrative, etching it into the official history of this day. As he spoke, I saw Thomas puff out his chest, beaming with pride at being so publicly anointed by this titan of industry. He was basking in the warm glow of a history he had not earned. That was the moment. The final piece of evidence presented. The prosecution, as it were, had rested its case. It was time for the defense. Or rather, the correction. Arthur de Winter finished his speech, raised his glass, and the guests dutifully applauded and drank. There was a pause, a natural transition point where the band would usually strike up again. Then S.C., a slick man in a tuxedo, was already moving towards the microphone to announce the cutting of the cake. In that perfect, brief lacuna of silence, I stood up. My movement was not sudden or dramatic. It was slow, deliberate, and graceful. But in this room of programmed events, this simple act of standing had the force of a gunshot. A ripple of surprise went through the room. Hundreds of faces turned towards me. The MC stopped in his tracks, a look of confusion on his face. The band, about to play, hesitated. I saw Thomas's face across the room. His smile froze, then melted into an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. I saw Isabel's hand fly to his arm, her fingers digging into his tuxedo jacket, her face a mask of cold fury. I had their complete and undivided attention. I picked up my own untouched glass of champagne and my water glass. I walked, with the slow, steady gait of a professor approaching a lectern, to the microphone that had been left on the stage. I did not hurry. I let the silence, the tension, the palpable shock in the room build. I reached the microphone. I placed my water glass on the small table beside it. I looked out at the sea of expectant, confused faces. I smiled, a small, serene, academic smile. "Good evening," I said, my voice, amplified by the sound system, clear, calm, and carrying to every corner of the tent. It was not the quavering, emotional voice of a doting mother. It was the firm, confident voice of an archivist presenting a paper. "For those of you who don't know me, I am Evelyn Croft. I am the mother of the groom." I paused, letting the words settle. "Thomas, Isabel," I said, turning to look directly at them, my smile unwavering. "My deepest congratulations on this merger. It is truly a remarkable transaction." The word transaction hung in the air, slightly odd, slightly jarring. "I know that the schedule for tonight is very tight," I continued, my voice still light and pleasant. "And my son and my new daughter-in-law were very clear with me that they wanted me to stay quiet tonight." A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the guests. It was a shocking, delicious breach of etiquette. I saw Thomas go rigid, his face turning a blotchy, terrified red. "And I intend to honor that promise," I said smoothly. "I will not give a sentimental, emotional speech. I am, after all, a historian. And we historians are not known for our sentimentality. We are known for our dedication to the facts, to the verifiable, documented truth. We keep the record straight. And in that spirit, I feel it is my duty tonight not to give a toast, but rather to offer a small, but crucial, addendum to the historical record that Mr. De Winter has so eloquently presented." My tone was so reasonable, so professional, that the guests were utterly captivated. This was not a drunken, embarrassing scene. This was something else entirely. This was theater. "Mr. De Winter spoke of Thomas's company, Innovatech, as a bootstrapped enterprise," I said, my gaze sweeping the room before landing, once again, on my son. "It's a wonderful, inspiring story. The story of a brilliant young man building an empire from nothing. The only problem with that story is that it is a fiction." A loud, collective gasp went through the tent. I had them. Every single one of them. A company, you see, cannot be built from nothing. It requires capital, a significant amount of seed capital. I reached into my evening bag and pulled out a folded document. I let it unfold. It was the signed loan agreement. "The seed capital that founded Innovatech," I announced, my voice as clear and steady as a newsreader's, was in the sum of $1,250,000. It came from a single private investor. I paused. The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. "That investor," I said, my eyes locking with Thomas's, "was me." I let the words land. I watched the color drain completely from my son's face. I saw the look of pure, murderous rage that flashed in Isabel's eyes. "It was not a gift," I continued, my voice relentless and calm. I held up another document. The collateral agreement. It was a formal business loan, secured by a 90% controlling stake in the company. As the primary creditor and majority shareholder of Innovatech for the last 8 years, I have watched its progress with great interest. I then picked up the glossy annual report. "And according to your most recent annual report, Thomas, the company is valued at an impressive $20 million. A remarkable return on my initial investment. You have, in that respect, been a very effective CEO." It sounded like a compliment, but it was the prelude to the execution. "However," I said, my voice dropping slightly, becoming more serious, more businesslike, "a creditor's confidence is paramount, and recently events have led me to lose confidence in the company's current leadership. There has been a breach of trust." I looked directly at my son, the man who had ordered me to be silent. "Therefore," I said, my voice now as cold and sharp as a scalpel, "us is my legal and contractual right, pursuant to the acceleration clause, Section 4B, of our signed and notarized agreement. I am hereby calling in the entirety of my loan. The principal, plus all accrued interest, is due and payable, effective immediately." The final, devastating silence. I did not need to explain what that meant. In a room full of business people, they all understood. A company of that size could not produce that much liquid cash overnight. Calling in the loan meant immediate insolvency. It meant bankruptcy. It meant the end of Innovatech. I looked at the wreckage of my son's face, at the pure theatrical horror on the face of his new father-in-law. I had not raised my voice. I had not cried. I had not made a scene. I had simply presented the facts. I had corrected the record. I raised my water glass. "So, I would like to propose a toast," I said, my voice ringing with a newfound, terrible clarity. "Not to the happy couple, but to the truth. Because history, ladies and gentlemen, unlike family, never lies. The truth will always, eventually, come out. To the truth. Na. Come. Gee." I took a small, delicate sip of my water, placed the glass down, and walked, with quiet dignity, off the stage, leaving behind the smoking, cratered ruins of their beautifully planned, perfect day. The silence was my standing ovation. I walked off the small stage with the same deliberate calm with which I had ascended it. The silence in the marquee was a living thing, a thick, heavy blanket of collective shock that seemed to absorb all sound, all air. I did not return to my seat. To do so would have been to participate in the aftermath, and my role in this event was now complete. I was the historian who had presented her paper. The ensuing debate was for others to engage in. My work was done. I walked, not toward the exit, but toward the grand, curving staircase of the main house, my movements measured and serene. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on my back, but I did not turn. I was a vessel of pure, cold purpose, and my purpose was to observe and record. From the landing of the staircase, I had a perfect elevated view of the tent, a historian's vantage point, overlooking the battlefield she had just created, with nothing more than the truth. The tableau below was frozen for a long moment, a scene worthy of a great historical painting, the wedding feast after the revelation. Thomas stood by the head table, ashen-faced and utterly rigid, a statue of a man whose soul had just been publicly repossessed. Isabel was gripping his arm, her knuckles white, her beautiful face a grotesque mask of fury and disbelief. Her father, Arthur de Winter, the great lion of industry, looked as if he had been physically struck. His face was a thunderous shade of purple, his mouth slightly agape. He was staring at me, not with anger, but with the stunned, grudging respect of one predator for another, more patient, more cunning predator who had just stolen his prize kill. Then, the tableau shattered. The silence broke, not into applause, but into a low, buzzing murmur that grew rapidly in volume. The sound of a hornet's nest that has been kicked. People turned to each other, whispering behind their hands, their faces alight with the delicious, scandalous thrill of a public execution. The jazz band, utterly bewildered, looked to the MC for a cue, but the MC was staring at the De Winter family, his professional smile gone, his face a mask of pure panic. Down below, the first signs of the collapse began. Arthur de Winter, recovering his senses, barked a sharp command at his wife, who in turn hurried over to Isabel, trying to shepherd her away from the public gaze. But Isabel shook her off. She turned on Thomas, her voice no longer a silken whisper, but a low, vicious hiss that I could not hear but could perfectly imagine. I saw her spit a word at him, her lips curling in contempt. I saw him flinch as if she had slapped him. The merger was already showing signs of a hostile takeover. Then chaos began to ripple outwards. I saw several men in expensive suits, men Arthur had introduced as his partners, huddled together, looking at Thomas not as a promising son-in-law, but as a toxic asset. Their expressions were cold, calculating. The anointing was over, the assessment had begun. I saw guests begin to discreetly, then more openly, get up from their tables and drift towards the exit, eager to escape the radioactive fallout of the humiliation, and even more eager to be the first to spread the story. The wedding of the year had just become the cautionary tale of the decade. My son, Thomas, finally moved. He stumbled away from the head table, pushing past his new wife, past his stunned new father-in-law. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes searching for me. He saw me, standing on the landing. His face, for a moment, was that of a lost 5-year-old boy. He started towards the stairs, his steps unsteady, but I had no more words for him. The historical record was now complete. I gave him one last, long, dispassionate look, the look of an archivist closing a book for the final time. Then I turned, with the quiet finality of a closing chapter, and walked into the house, leaving him stranded in the ruins of his own magnificent lie. I did not have to find my way out. One of the catering staff, a young woman whose eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and awe, silently pointed me towards a side door. As I stepped out into the cool, dark night, I heard the first strains of the band, a frantic, too loud jazz number, a desperate attempt to paper over the gaping chasm of silence and shame I had left in my wake. It was the sound of a party dying. My taxi was waiting, the same driver from before. He looked at me in the rearview mirror as I got in. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity. "Everything," I said, my voice calm and clear, "is now perfectly, historically accurate." The days that followed were a symphony of collapse, which I observed from the quiet sanctuary of my home. The first volley was a barrage of hysterical, incoherent voicemails from Thomas. They were a pathetic mix of furious accusations, "You ruined my life," tearful pleading, "Mom, how could you?" and bewildered questions, "Why? I don't understand." I listened to them once, as a historian would listen to an oral history of a defeated general, then I deleted them. The second volley was from the lawyers. Arthur de Winter predictably sicked his legal hounds on me. I received a series of threatening letters, all full of bluster about fraudulent inducement and emotional distress. My own lawyer, Mr. Davies, handled them with calm, dismissive professionalism. He sent back a single, simple response, a copy of the signed and notarized loan and collateral agreements, with a polite note inviting them to sue if they wished, at which point the full, embarrassing financial history of Innovatic would become a matter of public record in a court of law. The letter stopped. The third, and most telling, volley was the sound of silence. From Isabel, there was nothing, not a word. Her social media went dark. Her name, once a fixture in the society pages, vanished. A week after the wedding, I received a small, crisp notification from Mr. Davies. Isabel de Winter had filed for an annulment. The merger had been dissolved. The final act of the collapse came a month later. I received a formal, terrified letter from the shell-shocked interim board of Innovatech. My loan, they informed me, could not be repaid. The company's liquid assets were a fraction of the total due. They were surrendering their position. Control of the company, pursuant to the collateral agreement, reverted entirely to me. I sat at my dining room table, the same table where Thomas had once spread his ambitious business plan, and I held the fate of his company in my hands. I could have liquidated it, sold it for parts, and walked away with a significant fortune. I could have destroyed it, just as he had tried to destroy my voice. But a historian does not destroy the archives. She curates them. I did not destroy Innovate cheat sheet. I restructured it. I had Mr. Davies hire a forensic accounting firm to do a full audit, and I had them appoint a new, competent, and ethical CEO, a woman, as it happened. I retained my 90% ownership stake, transforming it from a weapon into a quiet, powerful, and very profitable asset. My retirement was now more secure than I had ever imagined. The last communication I had from Thomas was a handwritten letter that arrived 6 months after the wedding. The envelope was cheap, the handwriting shaky. It was a rambling, self-pitying screed. He was living in a small apartment. He was struggling to find work. His reputation, he wrote, was ruined. He accused me of being a cruel, unnatural mother. At the very end, he wrote the same bewildered question. "I still don't understand why you couldn't have just stayed quiet." I folded the letter. It was the final document for the archive, the final confession of a man who still, after everything, believed his own fiction. I filed it away in the Innovatech folder. And then I let him go. I let the ghost of the boy I had loved go. His story, from this point on, was his own to write, and I was no longer holding the pen. My new life began not with a bang, but with the quiet, satisfying click of a library door. A year after the wedding that wasn't, I walked back into the familiar, hallowed halls of the university archives, not as a retiree, but as a benefactor. With a small portion of the profits from my now thriving company, I established the Evelyn Croft Fellowship for the Study of Women in Business, an annual grant to support a young female historian in her research. I had become the patron I never had. My days now have a rhythm that is dictated by my own intellectual passions, not by the needs of a thankless child. I wake early, I drink my coffee while reading academic journals, and I spend my mornings in my own sunlit study, the room I have always dreamed of. The fireproof box is still there, but it now contains something far more precious than loan agreements. It contains my own work. I have returned to Eliza May Collins, the 19th century shipping magnate. I have retrieved her letters and ledgers from the university archive. They are on a long-term loan to me, their custodian. Her story, her voice, which I had silenced for 30 years in favor of my son's, is finally being told. My house is filled once again with the scent of old paper and the quiet excitement of discovery. The biography is slowly, meticulously, joyfully taking shape. My name, Evelyn Croft, will be on the spine of a book after all. I have not become a recluse. The fellowship has brought a stream of bright, passionate young women into my life. I host small, lively dinner parties where we drink good wine and argue about historical methodology and the interpretation of primary sources. They don't see me as a quaint old woman. They see me as a colleague, a mentor, a peer. They see me as Evelyn. For the first time in decades, I feel not like a mother, but like myself. I do not think about Thomas often. When I do, it is with a kind of clinical detachment. He is a closed chapter, a historical period that has ended. I have learned that some stories do not have happy endings, they simply have endings. And an ending is a form of peace. This evening, I am sitting in my study, a newly discovered letter from Eliza May Collins on my desk. In it, she writes to her brother about a male competitor who tried to cheat her. He mistook my silence for weakness, she wrote in her elegant, spidery script. He does not understand that a quiet woman is not a woman with nothing to say. She is a woman who is listening, who is observing, and who is choosing her moment. I smiled as I read the words. I had spent a lifetime preserving other people's histories, other people's truths. The greatest lesson I learned was that you must, eventually, be the historian of your own life. You must be willing to stand up in the great public forum of your own existence and correct a record. You must be willing to speak the truth, especially when they have ordered you to stay quiet. My voice, I have discovered, is not a liability. It is my greatest asset. And I will never, ever be silent again.